The wind came down from the north that morning, dry and sharp enough to scrape the skin raw. It carried with it the bitter scent of dust, sagebrush, and the faint copper tang of the dying autumn grass. Caleb Mercer stood on the porch of the ranch house with his arms folded, staring out at the wide spread of land that rolled away in every direction. It should have been a sight that filled a man with pride, a place hard-earned through years of sweat and sun, built with calloused hands and stubborn grit. But that morning it felt like a sentence. The letter was still clutched in his left hand, creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. County Clerk's Office, Property Transfer Requirements was stamped across the top in neat, impersonal letters. He'd read it 5 times already, but the words didn't change. If he couldn't produce proof of a legal marriage by the end of the month, the deed would revert to the bank. It didn't matter that every fence post had been planted by his hands, or that every head of cattle had been driven across the plains under his watch. The law didn't care. He hadn't thought much about marriage since Lavra died 3 years ago. She'd been the heart of his place, knew every horse by name, kept the books balanced, and always had a fresh loaf cooling on the kitchen table. When she passed, it felt like the sun went out. He'd thrown himself into work, figuring he could outrun the ache by staying busy. But now, the law was forcing his hand, dragging him into the business of finding another wife as though a partner could be picked away. You'd choose a new plow. Caleb wasn't a man who took easily to courting. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had a habit of speaking only when there was something worth saying. His quiet nature had always made him seem unapproachable, even when Lavra was alive. Now, with streaks of gray at his temples and a face weathered by sun and wind, most women in town saw him as a man set in his ways, too stern, too silent, too stubborn. The worst part was, he'd already tried. Over the past 2 weeks, he'd made the rounds in town visiting Mrs. Harlan's boarding house, stopping by the Mercantile, even letting the widow Langley invite him to supper to meet her unmarried niece. Every one of them had politely declined, some with a polite smile, others with a look that said no chance. They wanted someone charming or someone younger, or someone who wasn't still carrying the shadow of another woman in his eyes. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. The end of the month was only 10 days away. 10 days to either find a wife or lose everything he'd built. The thought made his stomach knot. The creak of wagon wheels caught his attention. He glanced up to see the supply cart from town heading down the road, driven by one of the Mercantile boys. They were making a delivery to the saloon. He could tell by the way the cart turned off toward the cluster of buildings at the edge of town. Caleb almost looked away until he noticed the commotion out front. A man in a bowler hat, Harlan Briggs. The saloon owner stood in the street, shouting at a small figure standing in the doorway. His voice carried across the still air. "I'm done feeding you, girl. You're more trouble than you're worth. I don't own you no more. Go find some other fool to keep you." The girl, no, woman looked barely more than 20 her. Dark hair tangled, her dress faded and patched in 6 places. She stood clutching a small bundle in one arm and something metal in the other, a frying pan, Caleb realized. Her chin was lifted, but there was no mistaking the humiliation in her eyes. Harlan gave her a final shove toward the alley, and she stumbled, nearly dropping her bundle. "And don't come back, Josie Lane. You're finished here." Caleb's frown deepened. He knew of Josie, though he'd never spoken to her. She'd been cooking at the saloon for the past year, working long hours for little pay. Folks whispered she'd been kept by the saloon in some arrangement she'd never agreed to, but she kept her head down and did her work. Now, watching her stand there with her few possessions in hand, Caleb saw the truth of it. She'd been discarded like a broken tool. He should have turned away. This wasn't his business. But something in the way she tightened her grip on that frying pan, as if it were the last piece of her dignity, made him pause. He thought about the letter still in his hand, the 10 days ticking away. The fact that every respectable woman in town had already turned him down, it was a reckless idea. Foolish, even. But in that moment, it didn't feel like chance, it felt like the only door left open. Caleb stepped off the porch, tucking the letter into his coat. The dirt road crunched under his boots as he headed toward town. By the time he reached the alley, Josie was sitting on an overturned crate, her bundle at her feet, staring at the ground as if trying to will it to swallow her whole. He stopped a few feet away, clearing his throat. Josie Lane? Her head jerked up, eyes narrowing. Who's a skin? Caleb Mercer. I got a proposition for you. Her expression sharpened, suspicious. If it's what I think it is, you can turn right around and... It's marriage, he interrupted. That startled her. What? I need a wife, he said simply. And you need a place to stay. I've got a ranch, plenty of room. Good food, steady work. You marry me, you'll have a home. No saloon, no Harlan Briggs. You'd be safe. She stared at him like he'd gone mad. Safe? You don't even know me. I know enough, he said, his voice steady. And I don't have time to know more. The county's fixing to take my land if I ain't married by the end of the month. That's 10 days from now. You say yes, we get it done quick. No strings you don't want. Just a deal. We help each other. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind rattling the loose boards of the alley wall. Josie looked down at her hands, then back up at him. There was wariness in her gaze, but also a flicker of something else, hope, maybe, or desperation. You're serious, she said quietly. I am. She swallowed, her fingers tightening on the frying pan. And if I say no? Then you? Walk out of this alley with nowhere to go, he said, not unkindly. And I walk away with no ranch. We both lose. Josie closed her eyes for a heartbeat, then opened them again. Fine, but I got one condition. What's that? No touching, she said firmly. Not unless I say so. Caleb gave a single nod. Fair enough. And just like that, the deal was struck. Two strangers bound together by necessity, each carrying scars the other couldn't yet see. The late afternoon sun slanted low over the rooftops of the little frontier town, casting the alley in a mix of golden light and deep shadow. Josie Lane sat on that same overturned crate, the rough wood pressing through the thin fabric of her skirt, the handle of her battered frying pan resting across her knees like a makeshift shield. The bundle of clothes and keepsakes she carried was so small it could have been mistaken for a loaf of bread, and in truth, it held about as much comfort. Caleb Mercer's shadow loomed over her broad shoulders, dust-covered boots planted firm. A man who looked like he'd been hewn from the very land he worked. He didn't shift from foot to foot, didn't speak just to fill the silence. He just waited. That stillness was more unnerving than shouting would have been. Josie had seen men make propositions before half-drunk cowhands slurring offers for a warm night, smooth-talking drifters who thought a smile could buy them anything, calculating glances of men like Harlan Briggs who saw women as inventory. But this was different. Caleb's voice had carried no honey, no leer. It was as if he'd offered her a job, plain and businesslike. Except the job title was wife. She tried to laugh, but it came out as a brittle sound. You must have hit your head on a fence post, Mercer. You walk up to a woman you don't even know and ask her to marry you? Caleb's expression didn't change. I'm not a skin for love. I'm a skin for help. And I'll give help in return. Her stomach tightened. Help. That word had been dangled in front of her before, usually with a price she couldn't or wouldn't pay. But there was something in his eyes, a steady kind of honesty, that made her pause. He didn't look like a man trying to trick her. He looked like a man already backed into a corner. And what happens, she said slowly, when you get tired? Of me? When some fancy lady from the city shows up who can bake pies and wear silk dresses. Caleb shook his head once. I don't need silk dresses. I need someone who'll stand beside me. The county says if I ain't married by the end of the month, they'll take the deed. That land, it's all I've got. My father built it, my wife and I worked it, I aim to keep it. If you're willing to help me do that, I'll make sure. You've got a roof, meals, and a place where no one can lay a hand on you unless you say so. Her jaw tightened at that last part. He'd picked up on more than she liked, that she flinched when a man stood too close, that she gripped that frying pan like a weapon. Josie's life had been a long chain of places where she belonged to someone. Else her uncle's cramped room above the livery after her parents died. A boarding house where the landlady paid her with scraps and chores. The saloon kitchen where she worked herself raw and still lived under the thumb of Harlan Briggs. Every place came with a lock on the door that wasn't hers to control. Now, here was Caleb Mercer offering something that sounded too much like freedom to be real. But there was no denying she was running out of choices. Night was coming, the temperature was dropping, and she had nowhere else to go but the dirt road out of town. She studied him for a long moment. His face was carved in strong lines, his eyes the color of a storm on the horizon. No softness there, but no cruelty either. He stood like a man who didn't lie because it was too much trouble. If I say yes, she said finally, what happens then? We go to the preacher first thing in the morning, Caleb replied. We sign the paper, and you come out to the ranch. I'll show you the place, give you your own room. You do what you're good at cooking, I figure, and the rest is up to you. I'm not here to make demands. Josie's fingers curled tighter around the frying pan. You're saying I could leave if I wanted to? He nodded once. I'm not holding anyone against their will. That ain't my way. The certainty in his tone made something loosen in her chest, though she didn't trust it entirely. And you promise no touching unless I say so? I give you my word. They stood there, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears and half-formed hopes. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked and a pair of cowhands laughed as they passed the saloon. Life went on, indifferent to the strange bargain about to be struck in a back alley. Finally, Josie took a deep breath and said, all right, I'll do it, but only because I don't much like the idea of sleeping in the dust tonight. For the first time, something almost like relief flickered across Caleb's face. Then it settled. She expected him to offer his hand, but he didn't. Instead, he stepped back, giving her space, and said, I'll meet you here at sunup. We'll take the buckboard to the preacher's. And if I'm not here? She asked. His eyes held hers, steady as a fence post. Then I'll know you made your choice. With that, he turned and walked away, boots crunching on the hard-packed dirt. Josie watched him go, the fading sunlight painting his silhouette against the street. She looked down at her little bundle of belongings, then at the alley mouth where the cold wind was already starting to slip in. For the first time in months, she had an offer on the table that didn't make her feel small. And for the first time in years, she had a choice, maybe not a good one, but a choice all the same. That night, she found a place to sleep in the abandoned shed behind the dressmaker's shop, curling up with her bundle for warmth. Sleep came slow, tangled with thoughts of a ranch she'd never seen and a man she barely knew. By morning, she would have to decide if she was really willing to trade the uncertain freedom of the road for the equally uncertain safety of a stranger's roof. The morning sun spilled across the dusty main street of town, painting the wooden storefronts in soft gold. The air was brisk enough to nip at the skin, but it was the kind of chill that carried promise instead of warning. Josie Lane stood at the edge of the alley, clutching her small bundle of belongings, the handle of her frying pan jutting out like the hilt of a sword. She hadn't expected to be here. Last night she told herself she might just keep walking at dawn, take the road south and disappear before Caleb Mercer came looking. But the truth was, she'd woken before the first light and the thought of stepping into the wide unknown. Alone had knotted her stomach. The memory of his calm, steady voice, "You'll be safe," had stuck in her head like a stubborn burr. Caleb arrived right on time, his buckboard wagon pulled by a pair of solid chestnut Murrays. He wore a clean work shirt under his coat, the collar just a little stiff, as if he dug it out for the occasion. Without a word, he climbed down, took her bundle, and set it in the wagon bed. "You ready?" he asked simply. Josie hesitated, then nodded. "I guess I am." They rode to the preacher's in silence, the sound of hooves and the creak of wagon wheels filling the space between them. The preacher, a kindly man with thinning hair, seemed only mildly surprised at their abrupt request. By the time the clock in the corner struck 8, the marriage certificate was signed, and Josie found herself standing next to Caleb as the preacher pronounced them husband and wife. No kiss followed, no awkward attempt at ceremony, just a firm nod from Caleb and a murmured, "Thank you, preacher." The ride to the Mercer Ranch was longer than Josie had imagined, miles of rolling prairie, dotted with the occasional cottonwood, and the skeletal remains of old fence lines. The house came into view slowly, a sturdy 2-story structure with a wide porch, the kind of place built not for show but for surviving wind, rain, and time. Behind it stretched barns, corrals, and open fields that reached the horizon. "This is it," Caleb said as they pulled up. Josie took in the house with a critical eye. The paint was weathered, the porch steps worn smooth, but the place was solid. The kind of solid that came from hands that refused to let it crumble. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and the lingering warmth of a morning fire. The kitchen was large but plain, with a cast-iron stove, a sturdy table, and shelves lined with jars of preserves. It was clear the space hadn't seen much care in a while. There was dust in the corners, and the bread box sat empty. Caleb set her bundle on a small bed in a room off the hall. "This'll be yours," he said. "You can change it how you like. We've got a spare room upstairs if you want something bigger later." She looked around at the narrow bed, the plain dresser, the single curtain fluttering in the draft. It was more than she'd had in months. "It's fine," she said quietly. For the first few days they lived like polite strangers. Caleb spent most of his daylight hours in the fields or with the cattle, returning late in the afternoon with dust on his boots and sweat darkening his shirt. Josie took to the kitchen like she'd been born to it, baking bread, cooking hearty stews, and slowly bringing warmth back to the place. They didn't talk much, just the necessary words to pass the day. Caleb would ask, "Need anything from town?" And Josie would shake her head. Josie would ask, "You want supper now or later?" And he'd give a simple answer. But in the quiet moments, they began to notice things. Josie noticed that he always stacked extra firewood by her door in the evenings, enough to keep her warm all night. Caleb noticed that his work shirts, worn and frayed, had been mended without him asking, the stitching small and neat. Neither mentioned these small kindnesses, as if speaking them aloud might break whatever fragile thread was forming between them. One night, after the dishes were done and the lamps turned low, Josie sat at the kitchen table, sewing by the firelight. Caleb came in, holding his hat in one hand. He hesitated, then said, "That stew you made tonight, haven't had one that good in a long while." She glanced up, surprised by the softness in his voice. "It's just stew." He shook his head. "No, it's more than that." Before she could reply, he tipped his hat and went upstairs, leaving her staring after him with a strange warmth in her chest. By the end of the week, Josie knew the sound of his boots on the porch, the way his voice carried when he called to the horses, and the rare curve of a smile when something genuinely pleased him. Caleb, in turn, learned that she hummed while she cooked, that she liked her coffee strong, and that she always double-checked the locks at night. They were still strangers in many ways, bound by necessity rather than choice. But under the roof of the Mercer Ranch, something quiet and steady was beginning to take root, something neither of them dared name just yet. The wind had changed. Caleb noticed it first out on the South Range, a dry, restless current sweeping in from the hills. It carried with it a smell he hadn't caught in years-old leather, stale tobacco, and trouble. He reined in his horse, squinting at the horizon, the vast sweep of prairie shimmering under the late afternoon sun. Nothing moved out there, but his gut told him he wasn't alone. By the time he rode back to the ranch, the sky had turned a bruised shade of violet. Josie was on the porch, drying her hands on her apron. She gave him a small smile, the kind that had been showing up more often these days, but it faded when she saw the tight set of his jaw. "What is it?" she asked. Caleb dismounted slowly, scanning the yard. "Saw some tracks near the south." "Fence. Horse tracks. Not mine." Her hand stilled. "Could just be a ranch hand from the neighboring spread." He shook his head. "No ranch hand rides that close without making himself known." That night, Caleb didn't go straight to bed. He sat by the window with his rifle propped against his knee, the lamp turned low. Josie could hear the faint creak of the chair from her room, and though she tried to sleep, her mind spun with questions she was too afraid to ask. 2 days later, the answer arrived in the form of a man on a black gelding riding up the Mercer Drive like he owned it. Josie was pulling loaves from the oven when the sound of hooves made her glance out the window. She froze. The rider was lean, all sharp angles, with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Caleb stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. The two men locked eyes, and something electric passed between them, something old, and not friendly. "Well, I'll be," the stranger drawled. Caleb Mercer, still scratching out a living on this patch of dirt. "What do you want?" "Harlan?" Caleb's voice was flat, but Josie heard the steel in it. "Just stopping by to say hello." Harlan's gaze slid past Caleb, landing on Josie in the doorway. "And to see who you got keeping your house these days." Josie straightened, meeting his eyes without flinching. Harlan chuckled. "Pretty little thing. Shame she's stuck. Way out here." Caleb took a step forward. "You've said your hello. Now turn that horse around." The grin faded from Harlan's face. "You've got something that belongs to me, Mercer, and I aim to get it back." Caleb didn't move. "Only thing you're leaving with is the dust on your boots." Harlan leaned in the saddle. "We'll see about that." Then he tugged the reins and rode off, leaving the air thick with dust and unspoken threats. After Harlan's visit, the air around the ranch felt different. Caleb worked longer hours, reinforcing fence lines and checking the perimeter. Josie started keeping the rifle within reach in the kitchen, though she'd never fired one in her life. One evening, as the wind howled through the cottonwoods, Caleb came in late. His shoulders were tight, his face grim. Josie was at the table, mending a shirt. "He's not after cattle, is he?" she asked quietly. Caleb hesitated, then sat across from her. "Years back, Harlan and I ran in the same circles. He wanted this land. Tried to buy it cheap when my father died. When I wouldn't sell, he figured he could force me out. I stopped him then, but men like Harlan, they don't forget. And now? Now he thinks he can scare me into giving up what's mine." Caleb's gaze softened slightly. "And that includes you." Josie's hand stilled on the fabric. "Me? You're part of this place now." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, but her chest ached in a way she couldn't quite name. The next week passed in uneasy quiet. Then, one night, the barking of the ranch dogs tore through the dark. Caleb was out of bed. In an instant, grabbing his rifle, Josie followed him to the porch, the cold night air biting at her skin. Out near the barn, a shadow moved too big to be an animal. Caleb fired a warning shot into the air. and the figure darted away into the darkness. "Get inside," Caleb ordered, but Josie didn't move. "He's not going to stop, is he?" Caleb looked at her, his face hard in the moonlight. "No, and until he does, we're going to have to be ready." In that moment, Josie realized that whatever fragile peace they'd been building was about to be tested, and the only way to survive was to stand together, strangers or not. The first real sign came before dawn. Caleb was already up, coffee steaming in his tin cup, when he heard the distant rumble of hooves. At first, he thought it was the neighbor's herd being driven to a new pasture, but the sound was wrong too. Concentrated, too purposeful. He stepped out onto the porch and scanned the pale horizon. Dust rose in the distance, backlit by the thin pink glow of morning. Josie came to the doorway, shawl pulled tight. "It's him, isn't it?" Caleb didn't answer. He didn't have to. The set of his jaw told her everything. Within the hour, the ranch yard was locked down tight. Caleb had posted 2 of his older hands by the barn and told the younger ones to keep watch along the fence line. Josie was in the kitchen, setting out bread and jerky for anyone who needed to grab a bite on the move. She'd never seen the place. So quiet, so tense, like the land itself was holding its breath. The riders arrived just after midday. There were 6 of them, Harlan at the front, that same mocking grin plastered on his face. They didn't charge in. They just sat on their horses, staring down the house. Caleb stepped forward, rifle in hand. "You've got nerve coming back here." Harlan leaned casually on his saddle horn. "I told you, Mercer. I came for what's mine." His gaze drifted toward the porch where Josie stood. Caleb moved just enough to block the line of sight. "You're not getting anything but trouble if you keep pushing." Harlan's smile vanished. "Then trouble's what you'll get." The next few days were a blur of harassment. Fence posts knocked down in the night, water troughs smashed, feed stolen. Harlan and his men never came all the way in, but they circled like wolves, letting everyone know they were there. Caleb barely slept. Josie could see the strain etching lines into his face. But she also noticed something else. Every time he came into the kitchen for coffee, every time his gaze swept over her to make sure she was unharmed, there was a flicker of warmth under the steel. One evening, as she was cleaning up after supper, Caleb came in, his shirt dusty from the range. "I need you to stay inside after dark," he said. "I can help," she insisted. You can help by being where I know you're safe." His voice was firm, but not unkind. Josie hesitated, then nodded. But inside, a stubborn ember began to glow. She was tired of feeling like a piece of property Harlan could claim or Caleb could shield. She wanted to be part of the fight. That chance came sooner than she expected. 2 nights later, the dog started barking again, but this time it didn't stop after a few warning shouts. Caleb and the hands were out in the yard in seconds, rifles at the ready. Josie grabbed the shotgun Caleb had left in the kitchen and followed. Harlan's men were driving a small herd of cattle straight toward the corral fence, hoping to break it. Caleb and his crew fired warning shots, scattering the cattle before they could do real damage. In the chaos, one of Harlan's men broke off and made a run toward the barn where the supplies were stored. Josie saw him first. Without thinking, she leveled the shotgun and fired into the air. The man jerked his horse away, startled, and retreated into the darkness. When Caleb found her, she was still standing there, breathless, the gun heavy in her hands. "You could have been hurt," he said. "I could have been useful," she countered. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, Caleb gave a single sharp nod. "All right, you're in this with us." The siege stretched on. Days of watching the horizon, nights of listening for the faintest sound out of place. Josie learned to shoot properly, to check the fences, to keep watch while the men worked. She wasn't just the cook anymore, she was part of the defense. And somewhere in that long stretch of fear and grit, she and Caleb began to move differently around each other. He trusted her to hold her ground. She trusted him to keep the worst of the danger off her. When they passed in the hallway, their hands brushed. When they shared a late-night cup of coffee, their eyes lingered a little too long. The threat was still there. But so was something else, something neither of them had expected. By the end of the week, Harlan had grown bolder. Caleb knew a direct confrontation was coming. What he didn't know was whether they'd come out of it with a land intact or with more to lose than either of them had bargained for. The day it all came to a head was hotter than it should have been for that time of year. The sky was a harsh, pale blue with no clouds to soften it, and the air shimmered above the dirt like the land itself was holding its breath. Caleb knew, before the sun hit its peak, that Harlan was coming. He could feel it in the stillness, in the way even the horses shifted uneasily in the corral. Josie stood beside him on the porch, her fingers brushing the stock of the shotgun she'd gotten used to carrying. She didn't ask if he was ready. She knew he'd been ready since the day Harlan first rode back into their lives. "Stay behind me when it starts," Caleb said, his voice low. "I'm not hiding in the kitchen," Josie replied. His mouth twitched, half irritation, half reluctant respect. "Then stay where I can see you." By mid-morning, the dust plume appeared on the horizon. It grew until the shapes of riders emerged, Harlan in the lead, his black gelding eating up the ground with long strides. There were 8 men with him. This time, all armed, all wearing the same smug confidence of men who believed they were about to win. They didn't stop at the fence line. They rode straight into the yard, boots hitting the dirt, the air thick with the smell of horse sweat and leather. Caleb stepped forward, rifle in hand. Josie stood a few paces behind, her heart pounding but her grip steady. "Well, Mercer," Harlan drawled, swinging down from his horse, "I figured today's the day you hand over the deed and save us all a lot of trouble." "You'd figure wrong," Caleb said. Harlan smirked. "You've been stubborn your whole life. But stubborn don't keep a man alive." Caleb's eyes narrowed. Neither does stupidity. It happened fast after that. One of Harlan's men moved toward the barn, and Caleb raised his rifle not to shoot, but to make his point. That was all it took for the air to crack open. A shot rang out from somewhere in Harlan's crew, hitting the dirt near Caleb's boots. The ranch hands answered back, and suddenly the yard was full of noise, shouting, gunfire, the wild stamp of frightened horses. Josie's world narrowed to the smell of gunpowder and the sound of her own breathing. She saw one of Harlan's men swing his aim toward the porch. Without thinking, she raised her shotgun and fired. The man jerked back, his hat flying off, and scrambled for cover. Caleb glanced over his shoulder at her, eyes sharp but full of something fierce, approval, maybe, or relief. The fight lasted longer than Caleb would have liked. Harlan's men were used to bullying smaller outfits, but the Mercer Ranch wasn't bending. Caleb moved with the focus of a man who'd been waiting years for this moment, his shots precise, his commands short and clear. Josie stayed low but steady, reloading when she could, covering the flank of the barn when one of the hands was pinned down. When the smoke began to clear, it was obvious who was winning. 2 of Harlan's men had been disarmed, another was nursing a wounded arm, and the rest were pulling back. Only Harlan remained in the open, his face twisted in frustration. "You think this is over?" he shouted. Caleb stepped forward. "It's over when you ride out and don't come back." For a long moment, Harlan didn't move. Then, with a sharp yank on the reins, he turned his horse and galloped away, his men following in a ragged line. Silence settled over the ranch yard, broken only by the labored breathing of the men and the restless shuffle of the horses. Caleb lowered his rifle and let out a long breath. His gaze found Josie standing on the porch with the shotgun still in her hands. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, though her knees felt like water. You? He managed a faint smile. Better now. In the days that followed, the ranch returned to its rhythm. Though the scars of the siege lingered in the broken fence rails, the patched-up bullet holes, and in the quiet moments when Caleb and Josie found themselves standing a little too close, speaking in voices too low. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Caleb found her in the kitchen. She was washing dishes, but stopped when she saw him in the doorway. "You could have been killed," he said softly. "So could you," she replied. They stood in silence for a beat, the unspoken thick between them. Then Caleb crossed the room, took her hand and said, "You're not just here because I needed someone to keep this place running. You're here because I want you here." Josie's breath caught. "And if I want to stay?" His smile was small, but real. "Then we stop pretending this is just about the land." Outside, the wind carried the smell of fresh hay and the faint memory of gunpowder. Inside, they stood together, knowing the land was safe for now and that whatever came next, they'd face it side by side.